What's up, everyone? Season 2 of Nova Now is officially back in action, and what better timing, because there's so much news happening right now, and headlines, they don't really make up their mind. They're like your favorite home team, which sometimes wins, sometimes loses, and just leaves you with a lot of questions. Well, that's where we come in. We're in search of facts. We just want the answers. And in every episode, that's what we're going after, and we do that by finding the science behind the headlines. Now, as you know, because you're faithful listeners, it's been a minute. It's been a few months, and a lot's happened during the pandemic.
The World Health Organization today declared the coronavirus a global pandemic.
Now, gyms were among the first businesses to close when the pandemic hit.
Major events have been cancelled or postponed for the first time in many years. From the Tokyo Olympic Games to football matches, fields, arenas, and stadiums will be empty for a long time to come.
But hey, we got creative, even without gyms. Being serious, I was doing pull-ups on traffic signs. People drove by and they're like, that guy's kind of weird, but kind of not, because we're in a pandemic and you got to do what you got to do. And then, in a clutch, fierce match, round 10, science got the knockout.
The scientists have done it, and they've used the virus itself to perform a kind of biological jiu-jitsu to turn the virus on itself in the form of a vaccine.
Whether it's tossing a ball or wrestling on the mat, young athletes all over are eager to get back to playing sports.
Whether you used to run marathons or compete professionally as a CrossFitter or just walk around outside around people, the pandemic forced most of us to slow, postpone, or cancel altogether our physical fitness routines to minimize the risk of viral spread. As infection rates drop and quarantine restrictions are lifted, we're using this episode to explore both the science behind our bodies in sports, what happens when we take a break, and ideas that might help all of us get back into the game. This is Nova Now. I'm Alok Patel.
Ride on!
I typically cycle about 5 days a week, 5 to 6. I train 12 hours a week if I count the strength training and the cycling, and a lot of it is indoors.
Stephen Seiler is a researcher and professor of exercise physiology at the University of Agder in Kristiansand, Norway.
By way of Texas.
And he's telling us about his impressive stats on Zwift, basically a training app.
I am coming up on 1,000 hours on Zwift.
You may not exercise that much. And with COVID-19 lockdowns and restrictions, there's a good chance your fitness routine completely became unhinged. Now let's turn to Seiler's expertise to better understand exercise physiology and how our bodies work.
Running is maybe what we're best designed to do. Walking, running, it's built into our neurobiology. We have this pattern, so children, you don't have to actually teach them how to run. It just kind of happens. But we've got a tremendous potential for getting more out of that genotype, you might say.
Genotype refers to the DNA passed on to an organism from its parents. In other words, an individual's collection of genes. And most genes contain the information required for our cells to synthesize or make proteins. And by exercising, we can actually alter protein synthesis. How cool is that?
And we can change the synthesis rates of different proteins, and what results is things like the blood volume increases, which means the cardiovascular system becomes more efficient. It pumps more blood per beat. We start synthesizing more mitochondrial enzymes.
The mitochondria, aka the powerhouse of the cell.
These aerobic factories that convert the carbohydrates and the fats that we eat into the energy currency of all of our cells. And so very quickly, when we get out the door and start doing some of those runs, we start to increase the production of that machinery. So we have more mitochondria. The body starts to actually build more tiny capillaries, the tiniest of those blood vessels that in that cardiovascular tree that starts with the aorta coming out of the heart and all the way down to just billions of tiny capillaries. Well, that network of capillaries gets even more dense and thick, and that's good. So just a tremendous amount of stuff starts happening. The brain changes to a certain extent. So, we start to get better at the actual running mechanics. And one of the things that probably people who first start running will observe is they get sore the first few runs. They're like, this is awful. How am I going to keep doing this? But it gets better because stretching that happens with muscles when you run, it actually kind of tears apart the membranes of those fibers. But that also triggers more synthesis of proteins in the connective tissue, so the muscles get more resistant.
They literally get tougher.
Then you don't get sore from those same runs that you were sore from the first few days. So there's just this whole cacophony of adaptations that kicks in pretty fast. And the net result is that you don't lose your breath as quickly when you start jogging. There's adaptations to the heat. You sweat faster, you sweat more, so you thermoregulate better. So, exercise is just one of the most potent stimuli for changes in our physiology that exists.
For millennia, even before the first Olympic Games of ancient Greece in 776 BCE, humans have recognized the importance of exercise and physical activity. But in the late 1800s and early 1900s, we started gathering and analyzing the data documenting its impact on our health. And these early epidemiological studies show that physically inactive people were more likely to have coronary heart disease than those with more active lifestyles. Translation: humans are meant to move.
And it kind of reflects the reality that we are designed for regular activity. That should be our baseline. Is genetically, we come from a history of moving pretty regularly, pretty often, every darn day, because we had to.
It totally makes sense. And I think a lot of people, including myself, saw the negative effect of sitting still, sitting on our rear ends all day long during the pandemic and just kind of feeling totally out of funk. From your perspective, what kind of physiological changes can you expect to see in the average person who just hasn't been able to get out there and get moving as much?
Well, the adaptations fade. The body is amazingly efficient. But what the body basically says is, I don't need this anymore. This organism is no longer asking me to do this work. And as quickly as that stress resolves, as soon as you quit doing this, when people go into space and gravity is eliminated, they also lose bone mass, they lose muscle mass, all of these things, because now that stimuli is not there. That's one of the big challenges with spaceflight.
Welcome to the International Space Station. As all of my family and friends know, I love to run when I'm on Earth.
Astronaut Karen Nyberg was a flight engineer aboard the International Space Station for Expeditions 36 and 37 in 2013.
Luckily, we have the capability to run here on the space station too. In fact, it's one of the 3 exercises that we do on a daily basis to help keep our hearts and our bones and our muscles strong while we're here without the gravity pull of Earth affecting our body every single day.
In a way, we've had a kind of a space flight situation because people were forced into their homes. They couldn't get out on their bikes. They couldn't run. In the worst scenarios, what we were seeing in Italy and in France and perhaps areas in the United States was, there was just really strict curtailment of the opportunities for exercise. So that puts a damper on your jogging and your fitness training. And now suddenly you do not have that stimuli for adaptation. And you lose some of the adaptations that were hard fought for with your regular jogging trips, your trips to the gym to do strength training. And so the muscle mass went down, the cardiovascular fitness got poor, and probably you were used to being able to eat more and you kept eating more. And so probably quite a lot of people gained weight. We saw a big change in body composition, less muscle, more fat.
And so as people try to kind of reshift and regain their 2019 body compositions, if you were the personal trainer for over 1 billion people, would you recommend people just go back out to their old routines or use this moment for a little reinvention, if you will?
Well, it's not an either or. I do think that we learn from some of these situations. The good news is, if I'm the coach of 1 billion people, I'm going to say, hey, you know what? That same body is there. That same capacity to adapt is there. Don't think you have to achieve it all in a week. Just get back out there, get the routine started again. Then everything else is going to happen. But I do think one of the problems that we're going to see is that people, they're going to be in a hurry to get back what they've lost. And then we're going to see various kinds of injuries. And so just ease into it a little bit, folks, so that we don't replace one reason not to be able to exercise with a new reason is because you went out there and ended up tearing something.
And I think easing into it is probably key for the majority of people who haven't been hitting the weight rack in about a year and a half. But what about the physiologic effects of the stress that you mentioned on our body? Is that something that people also need to take into account?
Well, stress is an interesting concept, but there are many different ways it gets triggered. And I think for a lot of people, exercise was a healthy release for this stress mechanism. And when it gets taken away, then for a lot of people, it was psychologically challenging. You know, they needed that. Their bodies and their brains had developed a certain dependency. Stress is accumulative. It comes from many different directions. And we generally have ways of mastering in it. But when we have these routines and they get abruptly changed and dramatically changed, that really challenges people. It challenged my daughter, who's a distance runner. And boy, Olympic athletes who are perhaps some of the most regimented, the most structured in their lifestyles, they were really hit hard. A lot of athletes were really struggling psychologically.
You look at these professional athletes, elite level athletes, and a lot of them stand in this hero space.
Cheyon Arigon is a biomechanist and chiropractor.
They start to feel like I'm invincible. They start to feel like this doesn't affect me. And so then they start ignoring how much this pandemic really did set them back, because really they were lonely, they were sad, they were stripped of the one thing that they pretty much did the most consistently all day. So a lot of times that's their outlet. A lot of times that's where they release. That's where they have the most fun. That's where they interact with the most people.
Adigun's also a two-time Olympian who competed for Nigeria in the 2012 Summer Olympics in the 100-meter hurdles.
And in 2018, I competed in the Winter Olympics as the driver of the first ever bobsled team for the continent of Africa, making me the only athlete on the planet to compete in both the Summer and Winter Olympics for an African country.
Through all this, she was struggling with some serious medical issues. So Adigun understands the body and mind of an Olympian athlete under stress.
Even the idea of feeling like, gosh, I can't do the things that I know that I'm capable of doing, or I can't be called on to perform in the ways that I know that I can perform. There are a lot of residual effects from that mentally that a lot of athletes are dealing with right now.
And it's not only athletes. We all have felt the force of the pandemic in our bodies. More on all that after the break.
Set. Well, a very good start there by Adigun of Nigeria, and she leads shot at the moment.
During her career as an athlete, Cheyon Adigun became a two-time, two-sport, two-season Olympian. And you may think she started off as track as her first sport, and you'd be wrong.
Funny enough, I was actually a basketball player, but I happen to be what I like to call hood fast. Which means you could beat everybody with your shoes off in the middle of the street, head back, elbows flying. So when I got to my senior year in high school, that was when I really decided that I was going to do this track thing for real. You know, I didn't really start running any times worth a Division I school noticing until right before, the month before going to college. Within my first season as a collegiate athlete, qualified for the national championships, and we all realized that, okay, maybe these legs were kind of made to run. I ended up becoming 3-time national champion for Nigeria and then a Summer Olympian. It just kind of sprung upon me after having friends in track and field that went into the sport of bobsled. So my friends that were competing in winter sports, cheering for them, seeing the sport, I was like, man, I think I can actually do this sport. You know, maybe I'm not done with sport, but done with track. So yeah, I ended up getting into the sport of bobsled and making the U.S. team in 2016. And that's when I realized that I needed to go ahead and do something bigger, which was to start the first African team.
I do have to ask you, what it was like transitioning to bobsledding as a track and field star and what you did to prepare. And the reason I'm asking this question for our listeners out there is because of a very legit video I saw about you building a training cart for bobsledding.
Yes.
Today's Monday, September 7th, Labor Day, 2015. I am trying to find the supplies to build a sled that I will practice with in Houston.
So I went to the hardware store and I picked up a bunch of wood and I built a sled out of wood in my garage. And it ended up becoming not only the most useful tool to help me stay competitive that season, but then it also became the most important tool at creating the Nigerian bobsled team.
I'm about to build the sled, y'all.
And Adigun didn't stop there. After all this, she combined her love of sports with her nerdy science side and became a biomechanist and chiropractor.
So I needed to understand every single part of what it takes fundamentally to execute a sprint, a jump, a throw, whatever movement that we're trying to do. What happens to the anatomy when we are trying to perform at our best? So I've been a biomechanist for about 10 years now, a little over 10 years, and really just understanding the shapes, sizes, forces, angles, the way that you move, and how that translates to injuries, injury prevention, and production of excellence. And so I translate the things that you do well or the things that you're inefficient at doing as an athlete and show you now how to do that. As a chiropractor, I look at making sure that everything from the joints, from the head to the toes, are all in optimal functional positions.
Adigun can absolutely empathize with some of her patients. When she got to the 2012 games, she herself was struggling with an injury.
I learned that I had a short tibia, and that was my lead leg for my hurdle leg. And at the games, I had a stress fracture in that leg. So this leg was at any given time ready to snap in half. And I thought to myself, what could have come of my career had someone noticed before the Olympic Games that I had an anatomically short leg and I had been able to train and adapt to an actual performance life with whatever I needed to be able to be the most efficient I could be. So I work a lot with NFL athletes, NBA athletes, and Olympians because what I have to offer is not just limited to what I've learned academically. Reaching the pinnacle of sport twice, hey, I understand, I get it, and I can envision what it is that you need as well as help you get there.
Watching you compete at the height of your track and field career, looking back on that, were you listening to your own body? Like when it came to the stress fracture, how did you, as an athlete, how do you juggle pushing yourself too hard versus listening to the physical signs, the physical manifestations of injury in our bodies?
So what I did in the peak of my career was I learned my body's language. I knew before the doctors even told me that if I got an x-ray that I had the dreaded black line. There was definitely a crack in that leg, for sure. I knew when I hit the ground, I was like, this leg is a goner. That year, because of everything I had gone through mentally, emotionally, physically with my health, and all of my entire career was essentially built up for that year. So me and my body had a very clear understanding of what was going to happen that year. We were going to keep going. And we were going to leave it to God to tell us that this leg was not going to make it. Because at that point, I was willing to allow my leg to snap in half before I was done. There was no way I was going to willingly accept defeat. So my body and I, we had conversations. Are we going too far? Are we not? We were getting treatment every single day. Acupuncture, laser, massage therapy, I had a chiropractor that I was seeing then. I would wear a sleeve. I would tape it every day. Like, I was doing whatever I needed to do to push out the inevitable, which was that there was a crack in that bone. So yeah, I had to rise to another state mentally in order to achieve what I did that year.
A lot of us were sitting around and saying, well, how has the pandemic affected training? I'm curious how it would affect a hurdler. I don't think you can practice jumping hurdles like in the living room or at Equinox. So could you give us an idea, using running hurdles as an example, of what it was like to train during the pandemic?
But people were riding their bikes, people were swimming, doing pool workouts, running in shallow ends just to get their sprint endurance up with low impact. People were taking mini hurdles, like these little wickets, and putting them in the backyard and running through those. People were trying to get as creative as they could. But there's nothing like actually jumping a hurdle or hurdling a hurdle. Training as a professional athlete, and a hurdler specifically, comes with repetition, right? Even when I had my stress fracture and was unable to train, the things that I leaned on was visualization. A lot of athletes who did not have the opportunity to train during the pandemic could only really rely on their visualization.
Numerous studies show that some of the firing patterns and neurological responses that come from visualization are also really useful when it comes to learning a complex motor skill. It's not just about doing the physical motion.
A lot of what people did during the pandemic, honestly, was a lot of nothing, right? It was a lot of at-home crunches, at-home push-ups, at-home squats and sit-ups, and, just things that were like, we'll be back at the track in a week. Oh, we'll be back at the track in a month. And so now you've got people trying to get ready for the biggest year in track and field, and they're coming off of basically a year of very inconsistent to minimal activity. When you go to a gym or a track or you train with your coaches every day, your body creates this like muscle memory. So when you break in that consistency, your body is trying to adapt to what this new reality is.
Were there any specific mechanical changes you saw in your athletes because of the pandemic, because of the inconsistent training?
A lot of misfiring of muscles. People were sitting for much longer, right? And so with sitting, you get a lot more shortening of like your hip flexors. So super, super tight hip flexors, and glutes were just not firing properly. Glutes being the strongest muscle on the entire backside of the body. They're supposed to be your power. They're supposed to put in all of your explosion. And now you've got people who are not able to really generate the same forces or powers that they were doing. So they're overcompensating. And so now I'm seeing so many more hamstring and groin strains. And now also getting people who are having these twinges in their knees because of the way that these muscles insert into these different joints. And one of the things that I was most nervous for was that this year, there were going to be a lot of injuries. Everyone's background training was weak, and they just kind of came up out of the dust and were so eager to get back to sport that they just jumped back in.
Perseverance is kind of like your entire MO.
Yep.
What do you say to people who feel completely defeated by the past year or more than a year? Especially the athletes out there. How do you motivate them?
I had the privilege of staring death in the face twice. What it did was it helped me value everything that I was experiencing while I'm still breathing. It taught me that every moment and every opportunity should be maximized. I survived it. So what am I gonna do with my time here now? And that was really what became my driving force. Opportunities only come once in a lifetime. And if you spend all your time trying to question whether you should do it or not, you're wasting your time. Just go for it. Just do it. You're here.
Is that a process of dealing with fear that anyone can apply to anything that they may be afraid of because of the pandemic and life after the pandemic.
What that is that common thread between everything that you've just heard, right? The broken leg, whether you're going to make it out of the pandemic successfully or not. Like, this is all about conquering that fear of the unknown, because you don't know what's on the other side of the door, but you won't know until you try. And the issue that people have when it comes to the word fear is that they allow it to disable them. I just wasn't going to willingly give up everything I had worked for that past 3.5 years to make it to the Olympic Games, when I knew that I had done everything that I needed to get there. Don't allow fear to prevent you from trusting yourself, because that's what fear does. It eliminates self-worth and self-trust and self-belief. Fear is just an opportunity to grow.
Back to the pandemic. Many athletes, both professional and amateur, like yours truly, spent weeks, months, or even more than a year inactive. We all went through something scientists call detraining.
The term we use is detraining. They're losing that fitness. But to a certain extent, it wasn't a big deal because all the big races were called off anyway.
Here again is Steven Seiler.
Nobody was able to compete. So everybody was in the same boat, and the boat was just basically sinking. Nobody could do anything. And the Olympics were delayed and world championships were not held. But there's a chronobiology that develops. Our biology kind of starts tuning in to that ebb and flow of energy and so forth. And then all of a sudden that's taken away. So everyone has been dealing with this in different ways. But if I stick to what I know best, which is sports and training, I think the psychological trauma was even bigger than the physiological. The good thing about being an athlete and having trained for years and years and years is there are some neuromuscular pathways. There are some adaptations that they don't go away very quickly. So that when these athletes have come back after some months, they get it back. And we do too. If you've learned how to play tennis, if you've learned how to swim and you've got that technique, well, fortunately, that's in there. Those pathways they don't disappear easily at all. They get rusty and you got to shake the rust off with some workouts, but you quickly say, okay, I can still ride a bike.
What's the take-home message for the person who isn't necessarily a competitive athlete, but just wants to work out 4 to 5 times a week?
It should be pretty enjoyable. It should feel, there should be something nice about getting out there and getting up to that steady state where you're breathing, you're sweating, but you're in a rhythm and you feel like you are in control of the exercise. The exercise is not in control of you. It's about intent and understanding that we have to balance, is having that rhythm. And my daughter calls it a training flow. We're in this for the long haul, folks. And what gives results for us as exercisers is continuity, is staying healthy, not getting injured, not getting burned out, and being able to get out there regularly. Are we going to push ourselves sometimes? Yes. Don't get me wrong. That's good if you can do that, but it can't be every day. Sometimes you need to be kind to yourself. That's part of that sustainability.
Compassion is key. Not just for us as a species, but for our muscle coordination strength. I love it. Dr. Seiler, thank you so much.
Thank you. I've enjoyed this.
Nova Now is a production of GBH and PRX. It's produced by Terence Bernardo, Ari Daniel, Jocelyn Gonzales, Isabel Hibbard, Sandra Lopez-Monsalve, and Rosalind Tordesillas. What muscle group are people not paying attention to?
Oh, man. That's a generalization.
Glutes.
Your gluteus maximus. It's the biggest muscle of your body.
90% of the people that walk into my office, glutes are not firing or are weak.
Use it, which means go a little deeper on squats, do lunges, because that big muscle will fade if you don't use it.
Julia Cort and Chris Schmidt are the co-executive producers of Nova. Dante Graves is director of audience development. Suki Bennett is senior digital editor. Christina Monin is associate researcher. Robin Kasmer is science editor. Lorena Lyon is digital production assistant. And Devin Robbins is managing producer of podcasts at GBH. Our theme music is by the DJ who always lifts me out of an inactive state, DJ Kid Koala. I'm Alok Patel. We'll be back in 2 weeks, which is plenty of time for you to go rock climbing, square dancing, surfing, make snow angels, do parkour, go spelunking, jump in a cricket match, chase squirrels, do pull-ups on scaffolding in the street. It doesn't matter. It's plenty of time for you to get out there and move.
GBH.